Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very conscious that I'm starting when I was due to finish, so I'll be trying to be as quick as I can without leaving messages unsaid this morning. I'd also like to start with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners on the country on which we meet and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders who are here. And I would really join Rob Oakeshot's call for us to all support the Yumi Unity campaign. I also think it's a real shame we haven't been prepared as a nation to go to a referendum and wholeheartedly embrace the constitutional reform that would be in that referendum. We were good at it in 1967. It would be great to think we could do that again because we all benefit from that acknowledgement of the first Australians. I'd like to acknowledge Rob Oakeshott, Senator Matt Thistlethwaite, councillors and distinguished guests here today and all the delegates to the conference. And thank you to Peter and RDA Mid-North Coast for inviting me back. It's a real privilege and treat to be here in Port Macquarie and to be talking about things regional. I come from Sydney, but I grew up all around the country as an army brat and have great fondness for the regions and understand that, as other speakers have said, it is really the regions that will drive the great strength of this country, and we need far more focus on regional development and leadership within the regions. And it's wonderful, Peter, to be invited to address your conference today. I am always really nervous, though, when I'm asked to speak about leadership, particularly as a visitor to a location where I don't have the local insights and understanding of the challenges and opportunities that you have here. So I'd prefer to offer a few views and insights that come from an outsider to this region and encourage you maybe to question or to comment, take issue with any of my comments when I rejoin you on the couch presentation after the morning tea. So these are really just my personal observations and to help you think these things through as leaders in your communities and your organisations and to start conversations, hopefully, in the conference and beyond. I do think the topic of leadership is probably one of the most overworked and least understood concepts that we currently deal with. We live at a time when the notion of national leadership is under constant scrutiny and criticism, and people are searching desperately for leaders. But I'm not quite sure that we define that. But when we see a leader, we know it. When we hear a leader, we know it. And often it's not in a national context. I think those leaders are far more obvious in the local, community and regional context. And just last weekend, I saw this in action when I went to my 13-year-old daughter's public speaking competition, where there were 28 schools around Sydney participating. The girls were 13 to 16-year-old girls. They all did fantastic, prepared speeches on the great topics of our time, from gender equality to human rights to soil. It was magnificent. But when they faced their terrifying impromptu 2-minute speech, they were given the kind of topic that I think all of us would struggle with, given 5 minutes' notice. And the topic was fall from grace. And almost all the girls who then represented, with only 5 minutes' notice on that very important topic, almost all of them cited the people that they admired and why they admired them. And they used words like authentic, open, courageous, and who always sought to learn from their mistakes. Their villains in their speeches tended to be of the Lance Armstrong variety, of the political variety, and people who are at a distance but have a capacity to fail us and fall from grace quite spectacularly. Their heroes, though, alongside Mandela and great national and international icons, were local people. They talked about the people in their communities and their regions and were quite clear about the fact that it was those people with a direct impact on them that they sought to look at for leadership lessons, and that they very rarely saw those local leaders falling from grace without actually pulling themselves up and dealing with the issue in a far more graceful way than many of those international stars that we currently see, unable to apologise and find some grace in their own behaviour. So it reminded me again that if 13 to 16-year-old girls get it, they're probably just saying something that we all know. And at that very tender age of looking for role models and leaders, they look for the things that we look for, and that is things that are very close to us and local. And so for me, the idea of leadership regionally becomes very important because it is local communities looking for their regional and local leaders to draw strength and to have role models. And as I said, this is particularly the case at the moment where we're having a chronic and very poorly managed debate on what is national leadership. What does a national leadership look like? What does national strategy look like? Who's actually controlling our future? And are they doing it well enough? So my talk was given the title Courageous, Curious and Inventive, very particularly because I think it's these kind of characteristics which will define great leadership in our communities and regions, and it's these kind of characteristics we need to seek more and to deploy more. I have a whole list of personal leadership attributes of which courage, curiosity and inventiveness are just part, but my most important one is about purpose. I think leaders at all levels, but particularly at regional levels, demonstrate that they have a desire to achieve something beyond themselves. Their self-interest is put second to the advancement of the community or the region or the country, and they have a long-term view. Rob Oakeshott made that point, that the long-term view matters to this country. It matters in the world now more than ever. And great leaders in regional contexts, I think, do actually sacrifice short-term pain for a long-term benefit to these communities. The courage I talk about is not just the kind of masculine view of courage and standing up and being heard, far from it. For me, it's about appropriate risk-taking, including the courage to open yourself up to challenge your own preconceptions and the notion of what relationships you'll need in order to deploy your leadership and your ambition. Curiosity and imagination. I had the great pleasure of working for Paul Keating when he was Prime Minister, and one of the most interesting things I think he ever said was when asked for his definition of leadership, and he said it was the active combination of courage and imagination. The two things acting in concert, not one pulling away from the other, but always knowing that that courage had to be underpinned by imagination, which for me is also about curiosity. For me, the leadership that I like to work with and enjoy most are those people who are terribly self-aware. They're open to their own lack of understanding, and they're open to the notion of connectedness and connecting and partnering and sharing a view and an ambition with people who may be the last people they thought they'd be talking about the issue with. We naturally tend to go to the people that make us feel comfortable. It's a natural human quality. It's why we end up with boards across Australia with lots of one gender of a particular era. It's why diversity matters, because we've got to push ourselves, leaders push themselves to actually confront themselves with people who don't share the same views, who bring a completely different context, whether that's from a different age, a different gender, culture, whatever the criteria. But that's a form of courage, is to be aware that reaching out to those kind of relationships are important. And I do think leaders need to be authentic communicators and listeners. They can't just communicate. The listening is important. Someone once said to me in a meeting where I was clearly leaning on the edge of my seat, not listening properly. They stopped the meeting and said, "I don't think you're listening, I think you're waiting to talk." And I caught myself and realised that's exactly what I was doing. I wasn't listening actively. I was waiting for the person to draw breath so I could jump in and make my contribution, because clearly my contribution was better, because I hadn't heard what the other person was saying. And to be stopped at that moment, to be told, are you listening or are you waiting to talk, has stuck with me. So I think leaders need to be great active listeners. That sometimes means a bit of silence and letting others have their views. And of course, we all feel this, we all know it, and we see daily examples of where this is breached tragically. Leaders at all levels must have the highest personal integrity. I don't think I need to say more about that. It is just, it's a self-evident fact, and that's why communities will move and will do things when their local and regional leaders have the highest personal integrity. So I think it's only leaders with those kind of qualities. We could debate that over the lounge chair conversation after the break. But I think leaders who don't possess those qualities are not going to have the skills and capabilities to deal with the very complex issues that you heard with a combination of the former two speakers, who gave us a very great context for the national and regional, both opportunities but great challenges that we face today. And I think you probably know better than anybody how these complex challenges feel. I think of them as a squeeze. On the one hand, we're constantly told that we're in deep economic insecurity, where there are global shocks that have very long impacts. They impact everywhere. In fact, the collapse of a bank in Victoria yesterday will find its antecedent somewhere in the global financial collapse and regulation, and its consequences will go deep into the Victorian community and beyond after yesterday's announcements. So we know that we're in a very fragile environment where shocks have great impact. And as a result, we've got everyone talking about the fact that there are many, many people facing job losses or underemployment. People are told to be more efficient, to cost cut, and to get ready for more economic and fiscal reform. We're also seeing economic experts across the world and the country in a contest, an intellectual and ideological contest between whether stimulus or austerity will drive our growth and our return to the good old days. Whether we ever want to be back there is debatable, but the debate is about stimulus versus austerity. And I think there's a really damaging conversation going on at the moment which is preventing us actually grabbing hold of some fantastic opportunities of the kind that Rob spoke about, which is a contest between growth and limits to growth, or growth and anti-growth. I actually think we can have wonderful, sustainable growth, waste-free growth, so long as we understand what it is that we're doing as we grow. I don't think anti-growth is going to get us anywhere other than an ideological contest. On the other hand, we can feel it, I'm sure you feel it, the murmurings and the sense of growth in local communities looking for some transformation. I'm sure it's the case here in the mid-North Coast through the RDA and through all of your operations. But people are actively talking about where does well-being and sustainability actually fit in our community. They're testing the validity of GDP as the best possible measure of development and looking for new measures of prosperity and resilience. In fact, just this week, Minister Tony Burke announced the formation of the first National Sustainability Council. I'm happy to be a member of that council now, but it's led by John Thwaites, who was a former deputy leader of the Victorian government, and that council has been tasked with the job of setting the national sustainability measurements against which the country can be judged over coming years. Now, I'm hoping people embrace the idea that that's a council and a piece of work that's aiming to look at prosperity and growth for the country and don't see it as a distraction to the traditional economic concepts of how we're going. But I'm also sure that you see that some of these things that we go between growth, non-growth, the ideas of GDP versus prosperity, all these things for me are somewhat false contests. I think what we're doing is we're seeing the arrival of community and therefore the regions and the people of the regions rising to say this conversation has to get better. It has to be better informed, it has to be more respectful, and we need to start looking at the various elements of these conversations, and rather than being stranded in a fight and a contest that goes to ideology, maybe we should go to a better definition of what growth might look like and who are the participants in this sustainable model for our country, a vibrant, productive country that has great prosperity. So this takes me to the notion of who are the participants. I come from a background largely in the corporate world, and I'm really heartened by the fact that it's corporates that we're now seeing beginning to talk about the challenges of sustainability, about environmental issues, social issues, poverty, unemployment, homelessness. They're using the language of sustainability, co-creation, shared value. This is now entering the business lexicon, not just here in Australia, but around the world. And in fact, just this week, IKEA globally announced over $2 billion worth of investments for the company to be energy sufficient, taking itself out of any form of dependence on any other provider of energy in the next 10 years. It's a huge commitment by a global corporation saying it will play its part in understanding the sustainability challenges faced by a big producer of waste, in effect. And their plan is worth having a look at because it's a rigorous plan and very difficult for a company to commit to other than having a view that it will actually grow their business. Virgin, I'm delighted to say, because of my involvement, is looking at new ways of producing sustainable jet fuel. It's a serious program working with academics across the country and putting serious money into the idea that as an aviation carrier we need to do our bit with the notion of finding sustainable fuels. We also do a lot of work on Indigenous employment, and the conversation at the board of Virgin is very much about our social contract with our customers, with the great team of people that work for Virgin, and to create an environment where people love the company because it doesn't just look after itself, it does actually engage in community activities, far beyond what might have been the historical role of corporates making their charitable donations. And at the same time, we're seeing some of the great civil society participants, organisations like WWF, questioning whether their strategies that were about anger and fighting the large corporates actually were going to ever win over general communities on the idea of environmental sustainability. So they're now reviewing themselves and looking for the kind of partners they need. And the international head of WWF, who was recently in Australia, is quite happy to say that she sits proudly on the Sustainability Advisory Board of Coca-Cola International to help push them on their water use, because she doesn't want to take an adversarial role against that company simply because she leads WWF. These are new models of partnering and understanding what it will take to build sustainable futures for all of us. And wherever I go at the moment, I'm seeing more and more of this. Wherever the AFL now goes, when we're establishing a wonderful new team, for those of you that like Aussie rules, I know I'm not in Aussie rules heartland here, but if you do like the game, setting up a club in the western suburbs of Sydney called the Western Sydney Giants and putting $100 million into that commitment to grow the game, which started with a commitment to education, employment and health, and whose first partnership was with the University of Western Sydney as an education partner. You don't expect this necessarily of a sporting organisation like the AFL, but that's where the community partnership does start. Two last things I just thought I'd mention about these new relationships relate, first of all, to mental health and then finally to climate change. Being a member of the Mental Health Commission for me has been revelatory. I thought I understood a lot about mental health when I joined the Commission, although I have no background in the practice of mental health provision. But to sit alongside mental health consumers and carers, led by a terrific chair in Alan Fells, and sitting and listening to the real story of mental health challenges in this country, for me has been has unravelled another set of issues that I think we should be thinking about when we think about a sustainable country. One of the things that's different about the Mental Health Commission, unlike a number of previous organisations, is that it wants to start a conversation in a different way. So the Commission goes out and meets with carers and consumers where they are. We're heading off to Orange in a couple of weeks to spend 2 days in Orange to understand the mental health issues of that part of the country. We've been to Geelong and we'll continue to seek the region's support in understanding what mental health means at the regional and local level rather than taking a national view necessarily. And we've decided to talk about this as a notion of every Australian having the right to a contributing life, as opposed to demonising or stigmatising those that have a mental health challenge. The thing that's fascinating about what the Mental Health Commission is doing is it's also opening up conversations that we haven't had with business, for example, and asking the question of large and small businesses, is there more that we can do to help employ people who either currently have a mental health issue or are seeking to gain employment and find it very difficult because we seem to be much more comfortable managing people's physical health circumstances and finding flexibility for those that have physical health needs, less so with mental health challenges. So the Mental Health Commission for me is another model of something that's changing, and I'd encourage you here in this region to think about whether you have something you'd like to raise with the Mental Health Commission in the way of a discussion as we bring forward our first report card later this year. Last example I'd like to give you is one that I hope one day will come here, and it's the work that Climate Works has been doing. Climate Works is a not-for-profit organisation that has been working with communities to encourage them to see that taking a low-carbon path is actually one of the fastest paths to growth, to economic growth and to community growth. You can look at the work on the website, but the first work was done for a low-carbon growth plan in Geelong. It's being deployed around Gippsland, and a wonderful local leader in the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, Brian Foster, has actually said recently that if they can get a low-carbon growth plan for the Eyre Peninsula, he thinks it will unlock extraordinary value across his community and his region to actually find new growth markets, not just in energy, but in the production systems around the Eyre Peninsula. Very different way of thinking about the carbon issue, thinking of it as an engine to grow sustainably in the regions. And the model that the Low Carbon Growth Plan allows is to work very much in collaboration with regional leaders. And I'd encourage you to have a look at the work as leaders yourselves. So what does that all mean in the end for this conference? I guess I just wanted to leave you with a sense that you have the leadership power in your own environments, in your own hands. I think in a world that needs transformational change and transformational leadership that will be driven locally and regionally rather than nationally, it'll take as much of your curiosity about who you partner with and why you haven't partnered with them before. Be curious about who's out there, who's your natural partner, who at the moment may not seem to be that partner. Your inventiveness about how to reframe some of these big issues and taking the negative and turning it into a business or growth opportunity for the region. Take leadership on the solutions rather than just, as Rob said, standing back and criticising. But most of all, it will take your courage. And I think some of the greatest courageous decisions and opportunities are taken at the regional level. I've seen that through Peter's briefing of me of what the whole RDA community is doing. So regional leadership matters, and I think it's got to be full of curiosity, inventiveness and courage. And I hope that over the day that we have ahead of us that you're able to think about those things and take that somewhere. And I wish you all the very best for a very prosperous and growing economy here in the Mid-North Coast. Thank you.